Look at it, but there was no settlement for 225 years. At some point, the Spanish were just overwhelmed. They didn't have the resources to cover all the land, so they weren't in a hurry to try and fund settlements there. At some point, the church said, well, you know what? If you give us this land, we'll start settlements for you, and we'll, convert everybody to Catholicism, and we will start converting them to what it means to be Spanish, or what it means to be civilized. We'll teach them how to act properly. We'll teach them how to farm, because obviously they severely need this. At least in their minds, that's what they thought. So it was in roughly around 1770s, I believe it was. 1776, the first mission in San Diego was started, and then from San Diego they slowly kept moving the missions up to basically San Francisco was the last of the missions. The mission period was a particularly interesting time. I mean, up to that point, while there was the Indians still had, the Native Americans still had their own tribelets. They weren't particularly large, even though they were maybe related family units. They weren't particularly large. Probably the largest would be about 250 to 300 in a tribelet in a village. And a lot of that has to do with the geography here. The mountains, the rivers separate them so that it's not as easy to get together. They have to cross the mountains. They have to cross the rivers. It was easier to stay in small tribelets and stay semi-nomadic, go where the opportunities presented themselves at the time. We'll talk a little bit more about why they did that, but they didn't have agriculture, and the reason they didn't is they had everything they needed right here. They didn't need to farm. The acorns, the fish, the shellfish, the seeds, the grasses, the milkweeds, everything they needed here. They basically just had to migrate slightly east to take advantage of what was happening there at the time. Then when the time was right, they would go back to the coast or head up the mountains a little bit to get the acorn crop. So they had everything they need without really needing agriculture. Which isn't to say that they did not practice forms of farming. When the Europeans first came, they said, look at all these oak trees. It's like groves. It's like orchards of oaks. Time and time again, they said there's orchards of oaks here. And that's because the natives were properly managing the trees to get the best benefit out of them, because a huge percent of their diet was acorns. A huge percent of their diet. In fact, it's not uncommon to think that they may have eaten some type of acorn mush or bread or meal or something like that almost every day. That was the staple of their diet, and so they would manage the trees, the orchards, for the highest possible yield. Manage the meadows for the highest possible yield. Manage the milkweed, the seeds, all of that. They know exactly when the fish were coming up. The salmon would come up to spawn. They know exactly when the best time to harvest the shellfish along the coast. So they had it all precisely down to exactly when they needed to harvest things, and they were able to get the greatest abundance from it that they could possibly do, and they did it really well. The mission period was tough. A lot of the beginning was good because a lot of the fathers or the padres that came in, they were actually learned men in most cases, and what they were doing is they truly wanted to help, but they also in most cases documented what they saw. So a lot of times they would write down about local customs, local languages, and they would document some of that. It was, as time went on, it became more of a chore, and you had the less altruistic, I guess I would say, or the ones that were really sort of, they didn't care about learning about the local people. They didn't care about that. All they cared about was, if you're not doing exactly what I'm doing, you're damned, and so you need to be changing your lives and do everything the way I tell you. And then life got much harder for the Native Americans, and in many cases what you saw was they started to leave. They would leave the missions and head into the hills and just sort of disappear. And so there was a real labor shortage then, according to the priests, because all the missions were built based on the Native Americans. So in the 1800s, 1821, I think, Mexico, which was New Spain, won its independence from the Spanish crown, and at that time, actually very little changed in California. There was two Californias at the time. Baja California, who are Spanish speakers. What's Baja California mean?
Bottom, lower California.
Lower California, and Alta California. Upper California. So there was two Californias: Baja, Lower, and Alta, Upper California. And so for Upper California, there was very little change. The missions were still in place; they were still running things. But the Spanish decided that they would provide this as open land, and so you saw a lot more what they called Californios, and these were ranchers, and oftentimes they would have the Native Americans would join them, and they were actually very good as ranch hands, as what we would consider cowboys, and they were very good at it. What you would have at the time is huge families owning large parts of Alta California as big ranches, and they would let the cattle graze or sheep graze, and then they'd use the local people as well as other Mexicans that were making their way up at the time, round them up at certain times and sell them. But the population in general, the European population in general, was actually very, very low. In 1848, well, actually, two years earlier, 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico. And it was about that time as well that you start to see the Russians show up in California. And the Russians were following the fur trade over, coming for the otter pelts, for following the fur seals down, following the elephant seals down, and the whales. And they actually set up a base north of San Francisco called Fort Ross, and it's not far from modern day San Francisco. And at that time, the United States said, okay, you know, now we got the Russians coming in here, we got the Mexicans that are in our back door, and whatever happened to Manifest Destiny? We're supposed to go coast to coast. This is supposed to be our world.
Canada too.
Canada too. Maybe they're still working on that. We don't know. But like
51st state.
So. All right, pipe down in the peanut gallery. So they decided they needed to do something about that, and part of that was the war with Mexico, and that was very successful for the United States. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, and essentially what happened was some money passed hands, which was very small, but the United States ended up with New Mexico, Arizona, and California all as